The labor movement. What was the labor movement? The labor movement was a civic fight by workers that evolved into a revolution. With industrialization rapidly accelerating in the later half of the 19th century, workers, especially the swarms of new immigrants, had new goals to improve the quality of their workplace. Now, what did the labor movement want to accomplish? For one, the workers wanted better working conditions. This included better safety regulations. They also wanted higher wages and shorter hours. This changed America's economic outlook by transforming the way that factories operated and propped up America's poor workers into a middle class. The unions. During this time, one of the ways that workers had to achieve their goals, such as higher wages and shorter hours, was to join unions. These unions were a group of workers that worked together to improve wages and conditions for all, such as the workers in the unions. These unions were successful because they were able to enlist large amounts of workers and were able to employ strikes. Strikes were when members of the union would stop working, which would force their employers to increase wages and conditions because now their workers were actually working, thereby losing great amounts of money. These strikes were employed rarely in order to force employers to negotiate with the unions or to increase wages and conditions. Many unions were also able to accomplish higher wages and better working conditions without striking. The Coalition of Unions. One of the unions at the time was the American Federation of Labor. This was a union established in 1886 for the development of skilled workers' rights and was very successful throughout the movement by advocating for its workers. They were successful because they were usually easier to work with than to fight against and mainly advocated for better wages and conditions for workers. Another reason they were successful was that they distanced themselves from political issues and societal issues, thereby just focusing on wages and better working conditions for their workers. It was also easier for the American Federation of Labor to increase wages since they mainly advocated for skilled workers, which could not be as easily replaced as unskilled workers. The Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, had the intention of promoting the social and cultural uplift of the working men and demanded the 8-hour working day. They believed that they could eliminate conflicts between labor and management as well. In some cases, it acted as a labor union. They grew rapidly because of their open membership policy and the growth of urban population. They allowed unskilled workers and semi-skilled workers, including women, immigrants, and African Americans. Soon after their rapid expansion, they lost all their new members due to their weak leadership and a series of ineffective strikes that include the Haymarket Square riot that killed 11 people. After that, most members abandoned the movements and most joined other, more effective movements. Like much of the revolutionary action in American history, violence in the labor movement was unavoidable. The Haymarket Square riot on May 4, 1886 left 7 policemen dead and another 7 policemen injured. The large labor rally was underway in Chicago's Haymarket Square, and in order to attempt to fend off the policemen who were attempting to break up the rally, a bomb exploded among the policemen. Ironically, the rally was largely to protest the police killing of civilians attempting to protest. Following the explosion, quote, then ensued a scene of wild carnage with revolvers, bludgeons, and other missiles, unquote, according to the Chicago Herald article the following day, which killed 4 more. In the trial, protesters were convicted of murder. This damaged the already floundering image of the labor movement, which had gathered a reputation as a hub for dissidents of various political grounds, as opposed to a movement to earn better working conditions. Another important act was the Pullman strike. The Pullman Palace Car Company, the employer of most in the town of Pullman, Illinois, had raised the price of living to a breaking point. With no room for competing companies to enter the town's economy, it seemed as though the company had a monopoly on the city of Pullman. The problem was compounded by the panic of 1893, a large stock market crash. While the company had cut wages down to 25% of what they originally were, they did not lower the cost of rent, water, or other parts of living in the town. In response, the workers, many of whom had already joined the American Railway Union, walked out. About a month later, at the ARU convention, the delegates gave the Pullman Palace Car Company an ultimatum: accept the demands of the workers or face a boycott of all Pullman trains. The company decided not to accept the workers' demands, and by the end of June, over 125,000 people were boycotting Pullman trains. Pullman eventually was able to connect their trains to those carrying U.S. mail. Because the boycott may have been interfering with the delivery of U.S. mail, President Grover Cleveland sent in troops to Pullman. The federal troops fired upon the crowd of workers, massacring some 30 people. The courts, however, ruled against the ARU by granting an injunction against the strike, and the president, Eugene Debs, went to jail. One of the most violent acts in United States history was the Homestead Strike in 1892. It was a lockout and a strike at the Homestead Works in Pittsburgh between the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, also known as the AA, and the Carnegie Steel Company, after the AA refused to take pay cuts of nearly 20% and decided to go on strike at their plant in Pennsylvania. Eventually, a fight broke out between the strikers and the Pinkertons, who were hired by the Carnegie Steel Company. It was eventually stopped by the state militia and police, who were called in because of the severity of the encounter. The strike would eventually end with the destruction of the AA, which was one of the largest craft unions at the time and was a major setback for their efforts to unionize steelworkers, which also further damaged the image of unions. The effects of the labor movement. The labor movement was important in the reform of workers' rights during the Gilded Age. The movement was successful in that with the creation of unions, workers were able to fight for their rights more, such as the 8-hour workday and increased pay. These unions employed strikes and were able, for the most part, to get increased wages and better working conditions. These unions and the strikes they employed helped spur the creation of rights created by the federal government for the workers. Before this, the government had not regulated the businesses of the time, but afterwards many regulators were made to help workers, such as the creation of the Contract Labor Act, which kept businesses from importing immigrants to replace striking workers. Also, many states started to regulate the working hours of the state towards the end of the century. This was highly debated at first, but proved constitutional in the case Holden v. Harvey in 1898, in which the Supreme Court verified that a Utah law limiting the workday to 8 hours was in fact constitutional. The government also started to regulate businesses directly, such as with the ICC, which was created to make sure railroad prices were fair and investigate the management of the railroad companies. Overall, the labor movement helped increase wages for workers, decrease time worked in each day, increase working conditions, and create regulations for businesses, which furthermore increase working rights.